This morning, if you'll open up to John chapter 1, it's where we will be. Although we'll actually start, our first text will be in John chapter 20. But we will end up being in John chapter 1 for the rest of the time. And this morning what we're going to be doing is taking a look at a phrase of sorts, a word that Jesus is called by John. Nobody else happens to use it, but John calls him the Word. And so we're going to examine exactly what John the Apostle means when he calls Jesus the Word, and what that means for us as well, because it does have a deep meaning to it, but it can also cause a little bit of confusion when we're not familiar with it, especially as much as the original audience would have been. And so, like I said, the first thing that we'll actually do is look at John chapter 20 for just a second. In John chapter 20, at the end of the Gospel of John, he gives his sort of thesis statement for what it is that he's writing. In John chapter 20, verses 30 and 31, verses that you very well may be familiar with, it says, "And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book," that is, in the Gospel of John, "but these are written," that is, in this book, "that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." Why did John write his book? John wrote his book so that, according to this very text, that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. Whatever he does in the rest of his book, that is his goal. And so when we look at the very beginning of his book, that is his goal. So when we open to John chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says, "In the beginning was the Word," whatever John means, it must mean something about Jesus. And so there's been confusion over time, and there's been confusion from maybe a too straightforward reading of the text to say, well, this doesn't really say Jesus. And so how can we know that this is referring to Jesus when it just calls him the Word? But part of that, as we just said, is that John is trying to tell us about Jesus. And so when he starts his gospel, who do you think he's talking about? Now, apart from that, a lot of the context here will make it clear that this is, in fact, Jesus, especially verses 14 through 18, can't really describe anybody else except for Jesus. But what we're trying to focus on is not just John's description of Jesus in general, but this use of the Word to describe Jesus. So let's start with a little bit of background about the Word. And because we have to, we'll mention that this word that we're talking about, which it gets confusing when we use the word over and over again, but still, this word that we're talking about from the original language that John's writing in is sometimes pronounced logos, although it would probably be better to pronounce it logos. Either way, it is a Greek word that means word. That's why it's translated that way. But really it can mean word, it can mean speech, it can mean a doctrine, it can mean an idea. And so it's kind of an abstract noun. It's not anything that you can exactly put your finger on, and yet it is a word with a lot of different meanings potentially, but most of the time when this word is used, it just means a spoken word. Or it can even mean the idea behind the word that's been spoken, but a spoken word. And so that's simple enough, but John's not going to use it in that way. Now, he will throughout the gospel. This word will come up again and again, not referring to Jesus, because we use the word quite a bit when we speak. But still, when John writes this, he's the only apostle or the only writer of the New Testament to use it in this way. And so you might even ask, well, why is that? Why does John refer to Jesus as the Word when Peter doesn't? And when even Paul doesn't? Well, there's probably different answers to that, but maybe one suggestion is because John writes so much later than the other writers of the New Testament. And so it may be that this became more popular as time went on, or maybe it's John himself that popularized the use of this word to refer to Jesus as the Word. And that's certainly true as we get into the writings of those men who started to write in the early days of the church after the close of the New Testament. They used the Word to refer to Christ very often, or the eternal Word of life, or the Word of God, or however they use it, but they mean Christ when they use it. And so John apparently started something where people would continue to use this particular phrase to refer to Jesus as the Word. But what is John's does this? Well, there's a lot of connections that we can make, and this is where we want to dive deeper into this idea of the Word. But the first connection is the one that John himself makes. What he says is, in the beginning was the Word. John is, in the beginning of his gospel, trying to make a connection to something else that anyone else reading it should know, especially if they're a Jew. If you're a Jew reading this, just as we as Christians today read this, what does your mind immediately go to when you hear "in the beginning"? That phrase is by choice. John is using it here to make reference back to Genesis chapter 1 and verse 1. So you compare Genesis 1:1 with John 1:1, and they start the same way, and that's very much intentional. John says, "in the beginning." And so in one sense, what he's trying to say is about Jesus, that he was there in the beginning. Not just the beginning of the gospel that I'm writing, he was there in the beginning of all things. Not only was he there, that the Word was there, but he was already with God. It's not that he came into existence when the beginning started out. Instead, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. He was already with God even before the beginning happened, and the Word was God. And we see here that John, without any hesitation, is saying that this same Jesus is in fact God. And we can talk more about that a little bit later in the lesson. So, along with this, though, as we continue into these verses, he was in the beginning with God, but in verse 3, all things were made through him, through the Word, through Jesus. And without him, nothing was made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. So let's take this comparison of Genesis and John a little bit farther to say this. What do we have structure-wise here? We have in the beginning, and then we have God. So in the beginning, and if you go to the end of verse 1, the Word was God. In the beginning, God. Verse 3, made all things. In the beginning, God made the heavens and the earth, right? And then you go to verse 4, in the beginning, what else did God make? It says, in him was life, and the life was the light of men. When John starts his gospel, what he says, in the same way as Genesis is, in the beginning was God, who I've just described to you as the Word. And in the beginning, when this was happening, he created, and specifically even he made light. Now he'll use light in a much more analogous way, in a not as literal of a way, to talk about being the light of men and then rejecting the light. But he starts out the same way. He says, just like in Genesis, in the beginning when God created all things, so Christ was also there. The Word was there. He makes all these comparisons. So that's the first connection to be made. This concept that Jesus is tied to the beginning. Along with this, though, there's a little bit more symbolic meaning we can add to what's being said. Jesus is, the Word is, the embodiment of God's message. So when we use this phrase, the Word, if you're a Jew especially, this should tie back to something else that you've heard again and again in the Old Testament. Not just at the beginning of the Old Testament, but toward the end of the Old Testament. Every time you open one of the prophets, you're going to start out that prophet almost every time with the same phrase, which is, the word of the Lord came to whichever prophet. The word of the Lord came to Haggai. The word of the Lord came to Amos. Okay, so the word of the Lord came to somebody, and so it is here, that the word of the Lord, in this case, has come to mankind. It's not that it's come to a specific prophet. This time it's come to man. The word of the Lord is here. It's among you. That same message from God, the embodiment of that is here in your presence. It has, in verse 14, become flesh and dwelt among us. Never has that happened before. When the word of the Lord came to Joel, it wasn't in physical form. It was through the message and through the mouth of Joel speaking, but it was never as physical as it is here. And so Jesus is the embodiment of God's message. Jesus also, though, is the embodiment of God's action, of God's purpose. Tying it back to the beginning again, but using a different text this time. Another text that describes some of what happens in the beginning is Psalm 33. And in this text, in Psalm 33, this is verse 6, there is a statement that's made that we'll tie in. Psalm 33:6 says, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made." Well, that's exactly what we just said in verse 3 here, that all things were made through the word. And without him nothing was made that was made. But Psalm 33:6, "By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth." God spoke the world into existence. He spoke and there was light. So when God speaks, action happens. But what John is saying is that word that God speaks, the action that happens, it happened through the word. It happened through Christ. And so there's some sense in which John's trying to say, when God spoke, Jesus acted. When God said that the world should be created, Jesus said, okay, then we'll take care of it. And we'll make that happen. And God in his power is able to do that. And so Christ is the embodiment here of God's purpose. That is, that Jesus as the Word is that same voice through which God speaks. Now, along with this, as we've been trying to point out already, if you are reading this text, not as someone in the 21st century in North America, far removed from any of these things, but if you're reading this text as the original audience, then you're one of two people. You are either a Jew who has been converted to Christianity, or you're a Gentile, meaning that you're pretty much Greek or Roman or heavily influenced by one of those cultures. In either case, when you hear the word, what do you think of? Well, we've kind of highlighted that for the Jews, but we'll talk about it again, and then we'll talk about what the Greeks would have thought. But for the Jews, there's a separation between God and man. And you can go all the way back to the law being given at Mount Sinai. And you think about how the mountain itself was covered in smoke and fire, and there was lightning and thunder, and it was terrifying for the people, and they didn't even want to hear the voice that was speaking. And from that day on, they said, hey, give us somebody to speak for you because we can't stand this. And so there's been that distance between God and man. And so when we talk about the word that's come, it has changed that. Now there is distance between God and man. In fact, look at verse 18 of John chapter 1 here. It says, no one has seen God at any time, right? So there is that distance. But when the word comes, what changes? We'll finish out verse 18. The rest of verse 18 says, the only begotten Son, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has declared him. He has spoken the word about him. And so whenever we see, it's true there's distance. It's true no one has seen God. But that was going to change because the word itself was going to come into the world so that people could have a connection with God like they had not had before. And so the word is sort of, even to the Jews, should make an understanding for them. This is a bridge between God and man that hasn't been there before. Along with that, when we say in the beginning the word of the Lord, or in the beginning the word, before this point, the word of the Lord had come through the prophets, like we said. Before this point, the word of the Lord had been around. But what it says here is, in the beginning was the word. That is, before the word of the Lord ever came to Jonah, before the word of the Lord ever came to Jeremiah or Isaiah or Daniel, before the word of the Lord ever came to anybody else, and before it came to humanity, certainly, the word was. That word already existed. It was already there with God. God used it in the creation. It was always present. It was always active. It was always Jesus. But now it's come here. And everything can be changed as a result of that. But again, if you're a Jew, you understand this to mean the word is God's message to me. Just as it was to the prophets, the word is the active message of God because it was able to create the world. And so I understand that this is now a bridge between me and God. In a very similar way, as we kind of already mentioned at the beginning, the word that we're talking about, and even from Greek, the word logos, it's an abstract thought, or it can be an abstract thought. It's the spoken word, or it's the thought that initiates that word that's being spoken. But to the Greeks, it meant something deeper than that in connection with their gods. Of course, they worshipped a lot of gods, and they weren't true gods anyway. But whenever you're looking at their connection, they use the word logos to refer to the divine way of thinking, the way in which their gods thought, which was kind of ethereal, it was abstract, it was so far beyond what they were able to think, very much in the same way that the Jews would have thought of God. They thought of their gods in a similar fashion, and they used this then to refer to, they used the word to refer to this kind of universal divine intelligence, or maybe to put it more simply, they would use it to refer to the mind of God. And so if they're saying the word, or if they're hearing somebody use the word and saying that the word came and was, or became flesh and dwelt among us, in a sense, what that says to the Greeks is kind of the same as what it says to the Jews, which is the mind of God has come to you. That's not supposed to happen. You might be able to go up to Mount Olympus and find out something about the gods. You might be able to pray to them in the right temple and find out something about them, but now it's been brought down to your level. And so whether you're talking about the Jews reading this or whether you're talking about the Greeks reading this, John has done something in a simple way, but a very impactful way for either culture, to say the word. Now to me, in the 21st century, to me in America, probably doesn't mean all that much. But if I'm one of the original audience members, it means a whole lot. Because it means that the God that I worship, whether that be the God of the Old Testament, or even if that be the pagan gods of the Greeks or the Romans, it means that God, the very idea of that God and the voice of that God, the message of that God has come here. He's not just spoken to me, but he has become present with me on earth in a way that has never happened before. And so what John does is he uses a word that's recognized by Jews to be recognized by Jews and Greeks to be the divine, that's recognized to be something that's equal with God, that's from God, and yet at the same time is clearly distinct from God the Father. So he's identified, yes, this is God who's come, but he's also identified what part of the Godhead it is that he's talking about. And so we could talk a lot more about that particular point, but we'll leave it there for now to say John has made the best use of the words that he had available to him to connect with his audience in a way that we probably don't appreciate very much unless we spend a little bit more time with it. And so what do we need to understand, though, from this idea of Jesus being the Word? Well, first, let's say this, that when we talk about the Word in John chapter 1, we mean Jesus. And John means Jesus. There's really not another option. But it is easy to miss, but if I miss it, then it's on me, because I've not done the study that I should to recognize what it's talking about. And it is a simple way to describe Jesus, but it's also a brilliant way to describe him as we've been talking about. But what does it really say about him? What it says is, one, that Jesus is the messenger to mankind. Just like the Old Testament prophets, he is the deliverer of this message. He is the message itself. And so without him, we wouldn't know anything of God the Father. Second, as we've said throughout, Jesus is the creator. So we find out by him being called the Word that he's tied back to the beginning. And when those words were spoken in the beginning and creation was happening, he was right there as part of that. The other thing that we learn is that Jesus is the bridge between God and man. And so that he is as we're told in other places in the New Testament, he is the mediator. He is the advocate before the Father. But whatever way we want to understand it, he is that bridge. He's the go-between between myself and God the Father. And so he is this saving message to the undeserving people of this world. The one other thing that we need to recognize about the Word, though, comes from one other text. And we'll read this text and we'll be done. And it comes from Hebrews chapter 4. In Hebrews chapter 4, we have another reference to the Word. And I think just as clearly as John uses this terminology to describe Jesus, that the author of Hebrews is trying to get across the same thing. In Hebrews chapter 4, in verse 12, Hebrews 4 and verse 12, it says, "For the word of God is living and powerful, and it's sharper than any two-edged sword, piercing even the division of soul and spirit, and of joints and marrow, and is a discerner of the thoughts and the intents of the heart. And there is no creature hidden from his sight, but all things are naked and open to the eyes of him to whom we must give account." When it says him and his in verse 13, it could be talking about the word of God and talking about God, but I think maybe more than that, it's talking about the word and saying that nothing is hidden from his eyes, the word's eyes. And so in verse 12 then, if we can understand this to be Christ, it makes a lot of sense to say that the word of God is living, certainly, powerful, yes, sharper than a two-edged sword, able to see into and to divide what makes up a human being, and what makes up the soul, and what makes up the body, and every part of that. And so when we look at Christ as being the Word, it's not just that he is the messenger, it's not just that he is part of the creation, it's not just that he's the bridge between God and man, but ultimately he also is the judge of all people. That this same Word that came to deliver the message of God will return with one last message from God. That this Word has the power with him and the ability to discern with him for judgment. So this morning we have an opportunity to reflect for just a minute on what John describes as the Word, but what we see as so much more than that. The longer that we spend with this idea, the more depth we can give to it. But when we look at the Word, ultimately what it talks about is this, or what we have to understand is this, that this Word came to tell the message of God, but will also come back to give the judgment of God. And that means this morning that you have the opportunity to respond to God in whatever way that needs to take, whatever form that needs to take. Whether that means that you become a child of his, that would be a wonderful decision this morning. If it means coming back to him again, you have that opportunity as well. If there's something you have need of, we're asking you to come forward now as we stand, as we sing.